Title: Whispers of the Shadow Realm. Chapter 1: The Stranger in the Alley. And the night air was thick, almost syrupy, clinging to Alex as he walked home through the deserted streets. He felt as though he was moving through a haze, the world blurring and distorting around him. Street lamps flickered in the distance, casting pale pools of light that barely held back the oppressive darkness. It was a night unlike any other, weighed down by an unnatural stillness that seemed to vibrate with an unseen tension. As he rounded the corner into an alley he used as a shortcut, a strange figure stepped into view, a dark silhouette at the alley's end, standing perfectly still under the single flickering street lamp. The man seemed to radiate a peculiar energy, as if the darkness around him was more alive, more dense. His face was hidden in shadow, but Alex could feel the man's gaze settle on him, a cold, assessing look that made the hair on his arms stand up. An odd sense of recognition washed over Alex. He'd never seen this man before, yet a peculiar feeling lodged itself in his mind, like the faint memory of a dream. His pulse quickened, and his steps slowed as he felt himself inexplicably drawn toward the figure. He knew, on some primal level, that he should turn around and walk the other way, but his legs betrayed him, moving him closer and closer until he was just a few steps away. "Alex," the man said, his voice smooth and cold as ice, cutting through the silence like a knife. The way he said Alex's name was strange, as if he were savoring it, drawing out the syllables with an almost predatory interest. The man's face was still obscured by the shadows, but Alex could see his eyes, a pair of gleaming, unnatural eyes that seemed to hold an abyss within them. "How do you know my name?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper, his mouth dry as sand. The man tilted his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "I know many things about you, Alex, more than you know about yourself." A chill raced down Alex's spine, and he took a step back, instinctively wanting to put distance between himself and the stranger. But something held him in place, an invisible force that kept him rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away. "There's a world," the man continued, his voice soft, almost hypnotic, "just beyond the veil of what you see, a place where shadows live and breathe, where they hunger for the light and feast on the unwary. You've felt them, haven't you? The shadows, watching, waiting." Alex's breath came in short, sharp gasps, his mind spinning as he tried to comprehend the man's words. He had felt something lately, a sense of being followed, of unseen eyes lurking in the corners of his vision, but he had dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the mind in the dead of night. Now, hearing this stranger speak of it made his chest tighten with fear. "I don't understand," he stammered, barely able to keep his voice steady. The man's gaze was piercing, as if he were looking straight into Alex's soul. The stranger leaned forward, and Alex could finally see his face, or rather, the lack of it. His features were blurred, shifting like smoke, as if he were barely there, a mirage in the darkness. Only those eyes remained constant, deep, empty voids that seemed to devour the light around them. "Once you notice them, Alex, they notice you," he murmured, each word a cold whisper that seeped into Alex's bones. "They wait for you to see them, to acknowledge their presence. And when you do, well, that's when they come." A shiver ran through Alex's body as he stared into those eyes, feeling a weight settle on his chest. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Who are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The man's smile widened, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, twisted and cruel. "I am nothing more than a shadow, Alex, a whisper in the dark, a reminder of what lies beneath the surface." With those words, the man stepped back, his figure melting into the darkness as if he had never been there. The street lamp flickered one last time before plunging the alley into pitch blackness, leaving Alex standing alone, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he glanced around, but the man was gone. Only the faint memory of those piercing eyes lingered in his mind, haunting him, leaving a stain on his thoughts that he couldn't shake. The journey home felt endless, every shadow stretching toward him, every flicker of movement making his heart race. The silence around him was oppressive, broken only by the echo of his footsteps, each one louder than the last. The world felt wrong, distorted, as if reality itself had twisted into something dark and unfamiliar. As he reached his apartment, he fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door and stumbled inside. He slammed the door behind him, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the lingering fear that clung to him like a second skin. But even within the safety of his own home, he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in every corner. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was just his imagination. But the memory of that stranger's voice echoed in his mind, whispering of shadows and hidden worlds. He flicked on every light in his apartment, hoping to chase away the darkness. But it only seemed to make the shadows deeper, darker, as if they were waiting, watching. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, he sank onto his bed, his mind racing with questions. Who was that man? How did he know his name? And what did he mean about shadows noticing him? As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he became aware of a faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. It was a soft, whispering noise, like the rustle of fabric or the distant murmur of voices. He sat up, straining to listen, his pulse quickening as the sound grew louder, closer, until it was all around him. The shadows in the corners of his room seemed to shift, twisting and writhing like something alive. His breath caught in his throat as he watched them, his mind reeling with fear and disbelief. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was frozen, trapped in place as the darkness crept closer inch by inch. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the movement stopped, the shadows stilled, retreating back to the corners, leaving him trembling and breathless. But the sense of unease remained, a cold knot of fear lodged deep within him, as if the darkness had left a part of itself behind. Over the next few days, Alex's life descended into a waking nightmare. The shadows were everywhere, lurking in the corners of his vision, shifting and twisting whenever he looked away. At night, he would lie awake, listening to the faint whispers that seemed to seep through the walls, filling his mind with dark, twisted thoughts. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head, a trick of his imagination, but the fear gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing day. He could feel the darkness pressing in, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. And then, one night, he saw them. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when he became aware of a presence in the room. A cold, oppressive weight that made his skin crawl. He glanced toward the corner, and there, half hidden in the shadows, he saw them. Figures, dark and twisted, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke, their eyes empty and hollow, filled with an endless hunger. They stared at him, their gaze piercing, unblinking, as if they could see straight into his soul. His body froze, his heart hammering as he felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. And in that moment, he knew that the stranger's words were true. The shadows had noticed him, and they were coming. This is a foundational portion of Chapter 1 that can be expanded further by adding descriptions of Alex's terror, detailing his daily attempts to escape the ever-encroaching shadows, and deepening the sensory experience of his paranoia. If you need additional expansions or specific parts to focus on, let me know. Chapter 2: Shadows that Move. Days passed, but the encounter in the alley lingered in Alex's mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. The stranger's voice haunted him, echoing in his thoughts at the oddest moments, slipping into his dreams, turning his sleep into a restless haze. At first, he thought he might be able to shake it off, tell himself it was just some disturbing run-in, but it soon became clear that something far darker had taken hold. The shadows around him were no longer mere shades of grey. They seemed alive, twisting and moving on their own accord, stretching out like claws reaching toward him. They danced when he wasn't looking, shifting in ways that defied logic, reshaping themselves whenever he tried to catch them in the act. At work, In the corners of the office, he would see them lingering, waiting in silence, distorting to form grotesque, elongated shapes. Even the mundane light of his desk lamp couldn't banish them entirely. Instead, it cast them into sharper relief, carving them into sharper, more defined outlines that seemed to throb with some dark, unseen pulse. The sensation of being watched grew stronger each day. He would catch movement out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of darkness just at the edge of his vision, gone the moment he turned to look. His co-workers began to notice the change in him. They exchanged worried glances, their polite questions layered with confusion as he stammered answers, trying to hide the growing fear gnawing at his insides. Late night walks. One night, unable to bear the oppressive silence of his apartment, Alex left, hoping that a walk might clear his head. But the night air felt different, heavy, almost suffocating. The streetlights barely pushed back the shadows. Their light was weak, thin, as though it had been diluted. The shadows clung to the ground, moving almost imperceptibly, like living tar that stretched and pulsed. As he walked, he became aware of something following him. Footsteps, faint, barely audible, echoed his own, each step perfectly synchronized. He turned quickly, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Only the street, empty and silent, stretched out behind him. But the shadows shifted, rippling across the pavement as though disturbed by some invisible presence. They seemed to quiver, to lean toward him, hungry and waiting. In a moment of reckless desperation, he called out into the night, "Who's there?" The silence that followed was almost deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. But then he heard it, a whisper, faint and chilling, drifting through the air like smoke. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, dripping with malice and amusement, like something dark and ancient toying with him. A cold sweat broke out across his skin, and he stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet as he hurried home, his heart racing, each step echoing with the invisible laughter that seemed to follow him. The shadows in his apartment. When he returned, his apartment felt strange, alien. The familiar walls, furniture and clutter all seemed subtly wrong, as if rearranged by an unseen hand. Shadows stretched across the floor, longer than they should have been, their edges sharp and jagged. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but as he moved through the room, the shadows moved too. They elongated, reaching out like fingers, trailing after him. He found himself moving faster, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts, until he finally darted into his bedroom, slamming the door behind him. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. But even that light seemed muted, dull, as if it couldn't fully pierce the darkness that filled his room. He stood there, panting, his back pressed against the door, listening for any sound, any sign that he wasn't alone. For a moment, all was silent. But then he saw it, a shadow on the wall, separate from his own, darker and more defined. It stood there, unmoving, watching him. He felt its gaze like a weight on his chest, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Slowly, it began to move, shifting across the wall, its edges blurring and reshaping, stretching toward him. Alex stumbled back, pressing himself against the far wall, his mind screaming at him to run, to escape. But his body was frozen, trapped by the weight of the shadow's gaze. It stopped just a few feet away, hovering on the wall like a dark stain. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he could make out a face in the shadows, a twisted, grotesque visage with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into him, filled with a hunger that went beyond anything he could comprehend. Unsettling encounters days turned into a surreal blur, each one more unsettling than the last. The shadows followed him everywhere, slipping into every corner of his life, a dark spectre that hovered at the edge of his vision. He became withdrawn, paranoid, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement. One afternoon, as he sat in a coffee shop, he saw it again, a shadow, darker than the others, lingering in the corner of the room. It seemed to watch him, shifting subtly every time he looked away, always just beyond his line of sight. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was the same shadow from his apartment, following him, stalking him. The people around him went on with their lives, oblivious to the darkness that clung to him. He wanted to scream, to tell them what he was seeing, but he knew they wouldn't understand. They would think he was crazy, that he was losing his mind. And maybe he was. Fatsi, Bourg the Mirror Incident. One night, in a fit of desperation, he looked into his bathroom mirror, hoping to see some trace of himself. Something to ground him, to remind him that he was still here, still whole. But as he stared into his reflection, he saw something else, a shadow lurking behind him, its form twisted and distorted, a dark parody of his own figure. Its eyes, hollow and empty, met his gaze in the mirror, and for a split second, he felt a connection, a cold, electric current that jolted through him, freezing him in place. The shadow raised a hand, mirroring his own movement, but the hand it raised was clawed, twisted, a grotesque imitation. Alex's throat tightened as he tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow in the mirror leaned closer, its face mere inches from his own, its hollow eyes filled with a hunger that he could feel in his bones. And then, in a blink, it was gone. His own reflection stared back at him, pale and terrified, but alone. The bathroom was silent, the shadows still, but the memory of those hollow eyes lingered, etched into his mind. Free, a descent into paranoia. By now, the shadows had become an inescapable part of his life. They were everywhere, lurking in every corner, waiting in every darkened room. He began sleeping with the lights on, hoping that the brightness would keep them at bay, but it only seemed to make them bolder. They twisted and stretched under the fluorescent light, mocking him, taunting him. His friends grew concerned, their polite questions giving way to worried glances and hushed whispers. He tried to explain, to tell them about the shadows, but the words wouldn't come. How could he make them understand something that defied logic, something that felt like a waking nightmare? He became a ghost, drifting through his days in a fog of fear and paranoia. Every shadow became a threat, every flicker of movement a potential horror. The world around him blurred, reality bending and twisting as the shadows closed in, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. This excerpt provides an outline for Chapter 2, with developed scenes of growing paranoia and haunting imagery. Further expansion could include more unsettling interactions with shadows, emphasizing Alex's eroding mental state as he loses his sense of reality. If you need additional details or specific expansions, please let me know. Chapter 3: The Library's Secret. Days turned into weeks, and the oppressive presence of shadows became a constant in Alex's life, invading his every thought and darkening every moment. Desperate for answers, he began to search for anything that could explain what was happening to him. The normal routines of his life felt meaningless now, stripped of their comfort and familiarity. All that mattered was understanding the shadows. One evening, driven by an unshakable compulsion, he found himself at the university library. It was a place he had visited countless times before, but tonight, under the cover of darkness, it felt different. The grand, imposing building loomed before him, its Gothic spires casting long, dark shadows across the cobblestone path that led to its doors. The windows, normally warm with light, were dark, reflecting only the faint gleam of the street lamps outside. Inside, the library was nearly empty, the usual sounds of shuffling feet and whispered conversations replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. The vast shelves of books stretched on like dark, endless corridors, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and aged paper, mingled with a hint of something else, a faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of his throat. Guided by instinct rather than reason, Alex made his way to the farthest, most isolated corner of the library. He'd never noticed this section before. It was darker, older, the shelves filled with books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in years. Many were leather-bound, their covers cracked and peeling, the titles faded into illegibility. But one book caught his eye, a large, heavy tome bound in black leather, its cover embossed with strange, twisted symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. The Book's Forbidden Knowledge. As Alex opened the book, The words seemed to pulse on the page, written in an ancient, indecipherable script. He traced his fingers over the text, feeling a strange chill creep up his spine. Just as he was about to close it, he noticed a note slipped between the pages, written in English. For those who seek, beware. Shadows are more than what they appear. They are watchers, keepers of the unseen, guardians of the forgotten. To see them is to invite them. To understand them is to belong to them. A shiver ran through him as he read the warning, the words burning into his mind. Ignoring the fear clawing at his insides, he continued turning the pages, finding passages about the Shadow Realm, a place described as lying parallel to the human world, hidden behind the thin veil of darkness that stretches over the earth at night. The book warned that the Shadow Realm was inhabited by entities known as the Veiled Ones, beings that existed beyond time and space, feeding off the fear and despair of those they haunted. He felt a sickening sense of recognition. The words resonated with him, matching the experiences he'd been having. The sense of being watched, the shadows that seemed alive, the oppressive weight that had settled over his life. Fratu, visions and hallucinations. As Alex read on, his surroundings began to blur. The words on the page seemed to twist and ripple, pulling him deeper into a trance. The walls of the library faded away, replaced by a dark, endless expanse, a place where shadows writhed and twisted in grotesque shapes. He saw glimpses of faces in the darkness, hollow eyes that stared back at him with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. He felt as though he were falling, tumbling through a void that had no end, his body dissolving into the darkness. Suddenly, he was back in the library, his heart pounding, his hands shaking as he clutched the book. He took a deep, shuddering breath, glancing around to make sure he was alone. But the feeling of dread remained, coiling around him like a serpent. For the warning of the librarian, just as he was about to leave, an elderly librarian appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. Her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and filled with a strange intensity. She looked at him with a mix of pity and fear, as if she knew exactly what he was going through. "You shouldn't be reading that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are things in this world that are best left unseen." Alex felt a chill run down his spine. "You know about this?" he asked, his voice trembling. The librarian's gaze hardened. "I know enough. That book was written by a man who claimed to have glimpsed the Shadow Realm. He paid dearly for his curiosity. Once you see the shadows for what they are, they become aware of you, and they do not let go easily." Her words echoed in his mind, confirming what he had feared. But the lure of the knowledge was too strong, a dark temptation that he couldn't resist. "But there has to be a way to stop them," he whispered, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can't live like this." The librarian sighed, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. "There are rituals, ways to protect yourself, if only temporarily. But each attempt comes at a cost. The shadows do not give up their claim easily." She handed him a small piece of paper, on which she'd hastily scribbled a series of symbols and words. "If you're desperate enough, try this. It might buy you some time, but be warned. It will only make them more aware of you." The descent into desperation. Back in his apartment, Alex sat in silence, staring at the symbols on the paper. The librarian's warning echoed in his mind, but he knew he couldn't keep living like this. The fear, the whispers, the shadows, they were consuming him, draining him of life. With a shaking hand, he began to trace the symbols onto the floor, whispering the incantations under his breath. As he completed the ritual, the air in the room grew thick and cold, and a strange pressure filled the space, pressing down on him like a weight. The shadows seemed to recede, pulling back into the corners, watching him with a newfound intensity. For a moment, he felt a fleeting sense of relief, a faint glimmer of hope. But then he saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was one of the Veiled Ones, its form twisted and distorted, its eyes hollow and filled with a hunger that was more profound than anything he had ever felt. The ritual had only drawn it closer, its presence more solid, more real. It spoke to him in a voice that was 1,000 whispers, a cacophony of sounds that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. "You cannot escape us, Alex. You belong to the shadows now." He tried to move, to flee, but his body was frozen, held in place by the creature's gaze. He felt his mind slipping, his thoughts unraveling, as the Veiled One's presence consumed him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. A terrible realization. When he awoke, he was lying on the floor, his body cold and stiff, his mind filled with a sense of dread. The ritual had failed, only making the shadows more powerful, more present. The book, the symbols, the librarian's warning. They had all led him down a path that had no return. The shadows no longer waited in the corners. They were with him, around him, part of him. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that they would follow him forever, haunting him, feeding off his fear, dragging him deeper into the darkness until there was nothing left. In the silence of his apartment, he could hear them, whispers, faint and distant, filling his mind with dark, twisted thoughts. The boundaries between the real world and the shadow realm had blurred, leaving him trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. As the darkness closed in around him, he realized that he was no longer alone. The shadows were with him, watching, waiting, and he knew, with a sickening dread, that they would never let him go. Expanding this chapter further would include more detailed descriptions of the hallucinations Alex experiences as he reads the book, heightening his interaction with the librarian, and delving into his despair during the ritual's failure. Let me know if you'd like more specific scenes expanded. Chapter 4. The Mark of the Shadow. After the failed ritual, Alex's sense of reality began to unravel. Shadows no longer lurked in the corners. They moved freely, weaving through his apartment, slipping along walls and pooling at his feet. His skin prickled constantly, as if touched by unseen hands, and the whispers had become relentless, a constant background noise that filled his mind with twisted thoughts and images. One morning, he awoke to find a dark mark on his wrist, a twisted spiral etched into his skin, stark and unnatural. The sight of it sent a shock of fear through him, an instinctive horror that he couldn't rationalize away. The mark was cold to the touch, as though the shadow itself had fused with his flesh, embedding itself into his body like a brand. The pain was subtle at first, a dull ache that pulsed beneath the mark. But as the hours wore on, it intensified, spreading through his veins like ice. He could feel it moving through him, creeping up his arm, seeping into his bones, and twisting through his mind. The mark seemed to draw him toward the shadows, as if it were a doorway, a connection to something vast and dark that waited just beyond the veil. Confronting the mark, in a desperate attempt to remove it, Alex scrubbed at the mark with soap and water, trying to wash away the dark stain. But the mark remained, etched deep into his skin, refusing to fade. The more he touched it, the colder it grew, until it felt like a block of ice embedded in his flesh. As he looked closer, he noticed something strange. The mark seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting as though it were alive. He watched, horrified, as it twisted and shifted, forming shapes that seemed to writhe beneath his skin. Faces, hollow-eyed and twisted in anguish, appeared within the spiral, their mouths open in silent screams. His breath hitched as he realized the faces looked familiar. They were his own face, reflected back at him, twisted and contorted, as if each version of himself was trapped within the mark, forever bound to the shadow. The Veiled One's return. That night, as Alex lay in bed, he felt the weight of a presence beside him, a cold, oppressive force that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He dared not turn, but he could feel its gaze on him, heavy and unyielding, like a physical weight pressing against his chest. The whispers intensified, filling his mind with dark thoughts, taunting him with images of himself lost in the shadow realm, a mere shadow of the person he once was. He felt the mark on his wrist burn, searing into his skin, binding him to the darkness. As he lay there, paralyzed by fear, he saw them. shapes moving in the darkness, barely visible against the shadows. They were the Veiled Ones, their twisted forms shifting and writhing as they drew closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that sent a chill through his soul. One of them stepped forward, its face mere inches from his own, and for a moment he saw his own reflection staring back at him, hollow and empty, as if he were looking into a mirror that showed not his face, but his soul. "You are ours, Alex," it whispered, its voice a dark echo that filled his mind. "You belong to the shadows now. The mark is a gift, a binding. You are one of us." The Veiled One reached out, its fingers cold and sharp as ice, and touched the mark on his wrist. A surge of pain shot through him, and he felt something dark and ancient latch onto his mind, coiling around his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the abyss. A descent into madness. Over the following days, Alex's world became a nightmare. The mark seemed to grow, spreading up his arm, dark tendrils branching out from the spiral, wrapping around his skin like chains. Every touch, every movement sent a jolt of pain through his body, as though the shadow itself were burrowing into his flesh, consuming him from the inside out. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with thoughts that were not his own, dark, twisted urges that sent shivers down his spine. He found himself drawn to dark places, seeking out shadows as though compelled by some unseen force. His reflection became a stranger, a dark figure that watched him with hollow eyes, its mouth twisted in a smile that didn't belong to him. He tried to reach out for help, to explain what was happening to him, but the words wouldn't come. His friends recoiled from him, their faces filled with fear and confusion as they saw the mark on his skin, the dark, twisted thing that was growing inside him. The world became distant, a mere shadow of itself, as though he were seeing it through a veil of darkness. Every sound, every movement felt wrong, distorted, as if reality itself were slipping away, leaving him trapped in a nightmare that had no end. Of the ritual of acceptance. Desperate and near the breaking point, Alex returned to the library, hoping to find something, anything, that could free him from the shadows. He scoured the shelves, searching for the book, for some hidden knowledge that might offer him salvation. But the book was gone, vanished as though it had never existed. The librarian, pale and frightened, told him that the book was cursed, that those who read it were never the same. She handed him a slip of paper, her hands trembling as she looked at him with a mixture of pity and horror. "It's too late for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The shadows have claimed you. The only way to survive is to accept the mark, to let it consume you. Only then can you hope to escape the shadow realm." The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread. To accept the mark was to give himself over to the shadows, to become one of the Veiled Ones, a creature of darkness, forever bound to the shadow realm. But he knew he had no choice. The mark had already taken hold, its dark tendrils winding through his mind, its whispers filling his thoughts. He could feel the darkness closing in, pulling him into the abyss, and he knew that the only way out was to surrender. To action the final transformation. Back in his apartment, Alex stood before the mirror, his reflection barely recognizable. The mark had spread across his skin, a dark, twisted pattern that covered his arm, his chest, creeping up his neck. His eyes had become hollow, filled with a darkness that reflected the shadows that had claimed him. As he stared into his own eyes, he felt something shift within him, a dark, twisted energy that surged through his veins, filling him with a strange sense of power. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with dark promises, urging him to let go, to embrace the shadows, to become one with the darkness. With a final shuddering breath, he surrendered, letting the shadows take hold. He felt himself dissolve, his mind slipping away, merging with the darkness, until there was nothing left of him but a shadow, a hollow echo of the person he once was. As he faded into the darkness, he saw the Veiled Ones standing around him, their faces twisted in dark satisfaction, their hollow eyes filled with a hunger that would never be sated, and he knew, with a terrible certainty, that he was theirs, bound to the shadows, forever lost in the darkness of the shadow realm. Petit Turukan. This chapter could be expanded further with detailed descriptions of Alex's mental breakdown, the sensations of the Mark's growth, and more haunting encounters with the Veiled Ones, deepening the horror of his gradual transformation. Let me know if you'd like additional expansion on specific scenes or aspects of the chapter. 40 Ban Jan Noi, Viet Lai Chuang, 4 Dai Hon ChatGPT Jan Noi, ChatGPT. Here's an extended version of Chapter 4, The Mark of the Shadow, with expanded scenes that deepen Alex's despair and horror as he becomes increasingly entwined with the Shadow Realm. This chapter includes vivid descriptions of his isolation, hallucinations, and an ultimate confrontation with the Veiled Ones. Chapter 4, The Mark of the Shadow. 1. The Dark Discovery. The days after the ritual were a blur for Alex, filled with cold, creeping dread and broken memories that felt as though they had seeped from a nightmare. He awoke each day shivering, his room dark even in the morning light, as if the shadows were suffocating any hint of warmth or brightness. It was on one of these mornings that he first noticed it. A dark mark, black as ink, twisting around his wrist in a pattern that made his stomach churn. The mark looked alive. Dark and swirling, it curved around his skin in jagged patterns, twisting and branching like thorned vines that wove beneath his skin. Every instinct screamed for him to look away, but he couldn't tear his gaze from it. His fingers traced the cold outline, feeling an unnatural chill that went bone deep, like ice rooted in his veins. As the hours passed, the mark pulsed, each throb sending a faint shiver of pain through his wrist. It felt like a brand, a permanent scar that bound him to the shadows in a way that couldn't be erased. No matter how he scrubbed at it, the mark remained, black and unyielding. And in his reflection, he saw something in his own eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before, a hollow emptiness that made him shiver. 2. Hauntings in daylight. It wasn't long before he noticed changes in his surroundings. The shadows in his apartment grew darker, sharper, taking on shapes that filled him with a silent, creeping horror. The light seemed weaker, dull, unable to push back the shadows that had taken on an unnatural weight. They pooled around his feet as he walked, rippling and shifting, as if they were alive and watching his every move. When he tried to go outside, the feeling only grew worse. On the street, the shadows cast by the buildings seemed to stretch toward him, as if they recognized him, as if he belonged to them. People moved through these shadows obliviously, yet he could see their shapes twisting, curling around their ankles and wrists. And sometimes, just at the corner of his vision, the shadows would take on grotesque faces, watching him with hollow eyes. At work, it became nearly unbearable. In the corners of his office, shadows lurked with a strange intensity, stretching across the floor, creeping along the walls, darkening his vision until he felt as though he were submerged in a pool of ink. His colleagues' faces appeared twisted, their eyes sunken, their mouths moving without sound, as if he were watching a silent film that had been distorted beyond recognition. No one seemed to notice his fear, his trembling hands, or the dark mark on his wrist that he tried desperately to hide under his sleeve. But he could feel it, pulsing against his skin, sending waves of cold through his veins, a reminder that he was no longer alone. The mark was a tether, binding him to the shadows, linking him to something vast and dark that lurked just beyond his sight. 3. The visions begin. At night, his dreams became horrors he couldn't escape. He saw himself standing in a darkened wasteland, a world devoid of light, where shadows stretched endlessly across a barren landscape. The ground was cold and rough beneath his feet, and in the distance, he could see figures moving, distorted shapes that seemed neither alive nor dead, slipping through the darkness with a grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. One night, he found himself standing at the edge of a vast abyss, a chasm that seemed to reach into the heart of the earth. From within its depths came whispers, faint, almost unintelligible, but filled with malice and hunger. The voices called to him, echoing in his mind, urging him to come closer, to let go of his fear and fall into the darkness. He would wake up each time drenched in sweat, the whispers still ringing in his ears, the memory of the abyss pulling at him like a siren's song. 4. Confrontation with the Veiled Ones. The days passed in a feverish blur, and the mark grew darker, spreading up his wrist in twisted tendrils that wrapped around his arm, crawling toward his elbow. Each day he could feel it digging deeper into his flesh, as if it were a parasite feeding on him, consuming him from the inside out. One night, as he lay in bed, a cold sensation washed over him. A presence, heavy and suffocating, settling over him like a shroud. His bedroom grew darker, the air thickening with a stifling weight that made it hard to breathe. And then he saw them, the veiled ones, standing at the foot of his bed, their faces shrouded in darkness, their hollow eyes gleaming with a light that was not of this world. The veiled ones were taller than he remembered, their forms stretched and distorted, their bodies shifting and writhing as though they were made of smoke. One of them stepped forward, its face mere inches from his own, and he felt a cold hand brush against the mark on his wrist, sending a jolt of pain through his arm. "You are bound to us now," it whispered, its voice a raspy, echoing hiss that filled his mind. "The mark is a gift, a bond. You belong to the shadows." "No," Alex choked out, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to pull away, but his body was frozen, held in place by the veiled one's gaze, by the mark that pulsed against his skin like a heartbeat. The veiled one leaned closer, and in its hollow eyes, he saw his own face reflected back at him, twisted and empty, a shadow of the person he once was. "You cannot escape, Alex. The mark binds you. You are ours." 5. Descent into madness. Alex's days became a waking nightmare. The mark continued to spread, its dark tendrils wrapping around his arm, creeping up his neck, branding him as one of them. He tried to hide it under long sleeves and gloves, but he could feel it pulsing, burning, a constant reminder of his connection to the shadows. He began to avoid people, retreating into his apartment, locking himself away from the world. The whispers were louder now, filling his mind with dark, twisted thoughts, urging him to give in, to surrender to the darkness that had claimed him. In the mirrors, he saw the shadows lurking behind him, their hollow eyes watching him, waiting for him to fall. His own reflection became a stranger, a twisted, haunted figure with hollow eyes and a face that was gaunt and pale. His skin stretched thin over sharp bones. He barely recognized himself anymore. Each night, the veiled ones returned, filling his room with their presence, their cold hands reaching out to touch him, to pull him deeper into their world. He could feel his mind slipping, the boundary between reality and the shadow realm blurring, dissolving, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. 6. The final revelation. One evening, in a last desperate attempt to rid himself of the mark, Alex returned to the library. He searched for hours, scouring every book, every scrap of paper, looking for anything that might offer a way out. But there was nothing. The shadows had claimed him, and there was no escape. As he sat in the darkened corner of the library, defeated and exhausted, he felt a presence beside him. The librarian, watching him with a mixture of pity and horror. "It's too late for you," she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. "The mark is not something that can be undone. It binds you to the shadows. Forever." Her words struck him like a blow, and he felt the last remnants of hope slip away, leaving him empty, hollow. He was trapped, bound to the shadows, a prisoner of the darkness that had claimed him. As he walked home that night, he felt the shadows closing in around him, wrapping him in their cold embrace. The mark on his wrist pulsed, sending waves of pain through his body, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was no longer himself. He was a shadow, a hollow echo of the person he had once been, lost forever in the darkness of the shadow realm. This expanded chapter adds depth to Alex's gradual transformation, his repeated confrontations with the Veiled Ones, and his final heartbreaking acceptance of his fate. Let me know if you need more development on specific scenes or additional details. Chapter 5. A Visit from the Veiled Ones. 1. A descent into isolation. As the mark on his wrist continued to spread, Alex became a prisoner in his own home. The shadows no longer hid in the corners. They were everywhere, swirling and shifting around him, wrapping around his body like cold, dark tendrils. His once familiar apartment had transformed into a nightmarish landscape of twisted shapes and unsettling whispers that filled his mind with dread. Every attempt to distract himself was futile. Reading, listening to music, even sleeping, nothing provided relief. The mark's presence was constant, a pulsing reminder of the connection he now shared with the shadows. Each time he looked at it, he felt something alive writhing beneath his skin, a darkness that seemed to feed on his fear. Friends and family had stopped calling. Even if they reached out, Alex couldn't find the strength to respond. His world had narrowed to the walls of his apartment, and the suffocating darkness that had seeped into every corner of his life. 2. Visitation by the Veiled Ones. One night, as he lay awake, staring into the dark, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. It was coming from his window, a sound that filled him with an inexplicable dread. He forced himself to sit up, his heart pounding as he looked toward the window. A face stared back at him, a twisted, dark reflection of his own, hollow eyes gleaming with a cold, malevolent light. It was one of the Veiled Ones, pressing its face against the glass, its mouth curved into a smile that was both familiar and grotesque. Its fingers, long and thin, tapped against the window, as if beckoning him closer. As he watched, the Veiled One's face began to shift, melting into a dark, featureless mask. Behind it, more faces appeared, twisted, silent shapes with hollow eyes, pressing against the glass, watching him with a hunger that was almost tangible. They moved in unison, their hands pressing against the window, leaving dark smears that pulsed and writhed. "You cannot hide from us, Alex," one of them whispered, its voice a rasping hiss that filled his mind. "You belong to us now." The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that echoed and overlapped, each one speaking in a language he didn't understand. He covered his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it seeped into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, filling him with a darkness that felt endless. 3. The shadows take hold. As the days passed, the Veiled Ones began to visit him more frequently, slipping through the walls, appearing in mirrors, their cold eyes always watching, always waiting. They lingered in the corners of his vision, shifting and writhing, filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating energy that left him gasping for breath. At times, they would reach out, brushing against his skin with fingers that felt like ice, leaving trails of darkness that lingered, burning into his flesh. The mark on his wrist had spread, twisting up his arm, dark tendrils branching out across his skin, each one pulsing with a dark energy that made his heart race. He could feel the shadows digging deeper into his mind, filling him with dark thoughts, urges that weren't his own. The whispers had become a constant presence, a background hum that grew louder each day, filling his mind with dark images, twisted visions of a world consumed by shadows. 4. A mysterious ally. One evening, while Alex was struggling to hold on to his sanity, he received an unexpected visit. A knock echoed through the silence of his apartment, and he froze, his heart pounding as he stared at the door. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, and the thought of seeing another person filled him with both dread and hope. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting one of the Veiled Ones to be standing there. But instead, he found a woman, a stranger with an air of quiet intensity, her eyes sharp and filled with a knowledge that made his skin prickle. She introduced herself as Lila and claimed to have experienced the same horrors he was going through. "I know what's happening to you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen the shadows, felt their pull. I know how they take hold, how they consume you from the inside out." Her words struck a chord, resonating with a familiarity that sent a chill down his spine. She seemed to understand his fear, his isolation, as though she had walked the same dark path. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Bitsatifa 5. The warning Lila explained that the Veiled Ones were ancient beings from a realm beyond human understanding, a world that existed in the spaces between light and dark. They fed on despair and fear, drawing power from those who noticed them, those who could see beyond the veil. The mark is a bond, she told him, her eyes dark with sorrow. It connects you to them, binding you to the shadows. The more you resist, the stronger they become. The only way to survive is to accept their presence, to let them in. It's the only way to weaken their hold. Her words filled him with dread, but he knew she was right. The mark had already consumed him, its dark tendrils wrapping around his mind, filling him with thoughts that were not his own. He had been fighting the shadows, resisting their pull, but it had only made them stronger, drawing them closer, binding him more tightly to their world. Asrul Bojki 6. A dark bargain. Desperate for a way out, Alex asked Lila if there was any way to break the bond, to free himself from the shadow's grip. She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the mark on his wrist, her expression dark and haunted. "There is one way," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "But it's dangerous. You would have to enter the shadow realm to confront the veiled ones in their world. It's a place where they hold all the power, where they can bend reality to their will. No one who has entered has ever returned." Her words filled him with a sickening dread, but he knew he had no choice. The shadows had already taken hold of his life, consuming him piece by piece. If there was even a chance of breaking free, he had to try. Lila handed him a small silver pendant, engraved with strange symbols that pulsed with a faint, ethereal light. "This will protect you," she said. "It's a talisman, a ward against the shadows. It won't save you, but it might buy you some time." 7. Crossing into the shadow realm. That night, armed with the pendant, Alex performed the ritual Lila had taught him. He drew the symbols she had shown him on the floor, reciting the words she had whispered in his ear. The air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural chill, and he felt the veil between worlds begin to thin. As he finished the ritual, a darkness seeped into the room, filling every corner, swallowing the light. He felt himself being pulled forward, his vision blurring as he slipped into the shadow realm, a world of endless darkness where the veiled ones waited, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. The landscape was twisted, distorted, a nightmarish version of his own world, where shadows moved like living creatures, writhing and twisting across the ground. The sky was a vast, empty void, filled with a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The veiled ones appeared around him, their forms shifting and blurring, their hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. He clutched the pendant tightly, feeling its warmth against his skin, a faint reminder of the world he had left behind. 8. A battle of wills. As he faced the veiled ones, he felt their presence pressing against him, suffocating, filling his mind with a darkness that threatened to consume him. They whispered to him, filling his thoughts with visions of despair, of a world where light could never touch, where hope was nothing but an illusion. He resisted, focusing on the pendant, on the warmth it brought, grounding himself in the faint memory of the world he had once known. The veiled ones drew closer, their hands reaching out, their fingers brushing against his skin, leaving trails of darkness that burned into his flesh. But he held his ground, refusing to let them take him, refusing to let them consume him. In that moment, he felt a surge of strength, a spark of light that pulsed through his body, pushing back the darkness. The veiled ones recoiled, their forms blurring, their hollow eyes filled with a fury that sent a chill through his soul. For the first time, he saw fear in their eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that gave him a sliver of hope. 9. A narrow escape. With the last of his strength, he forced himself to turn away from the veiled ones, to focus on the faint glimmer of light that lingered in his mind. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring as he felt himself slipping through the veil, back into his own world. Okay in his apartment, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as he realized he had escaped. The mark on his wrist had faded, its dark tendrils receding, leaving only a faint scar as a reminder of the darkness he had faced. But he knew that the veiled ones were still watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows, their eyes always fixed on him, their whispers still echoing in his mind. He had survived, but the shadows would never truly let him go. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that one day they would return. Chapter 6. The Ritual of Binding. 1. Preparation and isolation days had passed since Alex's journey into the shadow realm, but its shadows lingered, twisting through his apartment like an unwanted guest. Each night, he felt their oppressive presence crowding closer, as if the walls themselves were shrinking, trapping him within their cold grasp. He could sense the veiled ones lingering just beyond his vision, watching, waiting, their whispers faint yet unceasing, eroding his sanity like water wearing down stone. He hadn't heard from Lila since that night. Her words, cryptic, ominous, replayed in his mind, each warning cutting deeper as he realized the full weight of his predicament. She had told him about the ritual of binding, a final, desperate attempt to sever his connection to the shadows, to rid himself of the mark that had bound him to them. But there was no guarantee it would work, no certainty it would free him. With nothing left to lose, Alex decided to attempt the ritual. 2. The ritual begins. The instructions were etched into his mind, their words half remembered, half felt, as though they had always been lurking just below the surface, waiting for him to reach for them. He drew a circle on the floor of his apartment, marking it with symbols he barely understood, ancient runes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy of their own. Around the circle, he placed candles, their dim, flickering light barely illuminating the shadows that clung to the walls. He gathered items that held personal significance, objects that grounded him in reality, memories from a life that felt increasingly distant, an old photo of his family, a letter from an old friend, the watch his father had given him. These he placed within the circle, hoping they would anchor him, keep him connected to the world he was trying so desperately to hold on to. As he whispered the incantation, the air grew heavy, thick with a chill that seeped into his bones. His breath clouded in the air, his heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the shadows seemed to pulse, moving with a life of their own, stretching toward him as if drawn by the ritual itself. 3. The darkness unleashed. The whispers intensified, filling the room, echoing off the walls, building into a chorus of voices that wrapped around his mind, clouding his thoughts, drowning out the words of the ritual. His vision blurred, the symbols on the floor twisting, melting, reshaping themselves into faces, dark, twisted visages that sneered and taunted him. He felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, followed by another on his arm, icy fingers gripping him with a strength that defied their ephemeral nature. He dared not look, but he could sense them, the veiled ones, their hollow eyes watching him, their breath cold against his skin. "You cannot escape us, Alex," they whispered, their voices overlapping, filling his mind with dark thoughts, images of despair, of a world where shadows reigned, where light was nothing but a distant memory. "You belong to us. The mark binds you. The ritual cannot sever what has already taken root." He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to continue, reciting the words with renewed fervor, his voice rising above the whispers, cutting through the darkness with a desperation that bordered on madness. 4. The vision of his past. The veiled ones tightened their grip, their cold fingers digging into his skin, pulling him backward, dragging him into a vision, a memory twisted by shadow, darkened and warped. He was standing in his childhood home, a place he hadn't seen in years, but it was different now, cloaked in darkness, its familiar warmth replaced by a chilling, empty silence. He wandered through the rooms, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, his heart pounding as he realized he was alone. Shadows clung to the walls, watching him, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. His family's faces appeared in the darkness, hollow and distorted, their eyes filled with a sorrow that tore at his heart. "Why did you leave us, Alex?" a voice whispered, his mother's voice, filled with an accusation that cut him to the core. "You abandoned us, left us to the shadows." The words sank into him, a poison that seeped into his mind, twisting his memories, filling him with a guilt that felt as real as the shadows that surrounded him. 5. Confronting his darkest fears. The vision shifted, pulling him through a series of scenes from his life, each one darker, more twisted than the last. He saw himself alone in a desolate landscape, surrounded by shadows that circled him like predators, waiting for the moment he would give in, surrender to the darkness. Each vision was a manifestation of his deepest fears, his regrets, his insecurities, all twisted and magnified by the veiled ones, their whispers feeding his despair, amplifying his hopelessness. He felt himself slipping, his will weakening, his connection to reality fraying with each passing moment. But he forced himself to remember why he was doing this, to hold on to the fragments of hope, of light, that had brought him this far. The memories of his family, his friends, the life he had once known. They were the only things keeping him tethered to the world, the only shield he had against the encroaching darkness. 6. The final stand. As he continued the ritual, the shadows grew angrier, their voices rising to a fever pitch, filling the room with a sound that was both beautiful and terrible, a symphony of despair that reverberated through his mind, shaking him to his core. The mark on his wrist burned, searing his skin, filling him with a pain that was almost unbearable. He could feel it spreading, dark tendrils wrapping around his arm, twisting up toward his chest, his throat, threatening to consume him entirely. In a final act of defiance, he reached into himself, summoning the last of his strength, the remnants of his will, and pushed back against the darkness, against the mark, against the veiled ones. He poured every ounce of himself into the ritual, his voice rising above the whispers, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The air trembled, the candles flickered wildly, and for a brief shining moment, he felt the darkness recoil, retreating, the connection between him and the veiled ones weakening. 7. A hollow victory, but as quickly as it had begun, the feeling faded, leaving him empty, hollow, the room silent once more. He looked down at his wrist, hoping to see the mark gone, but it remained, dark and unyielding, a reminder of the bond he could never break. The ritual had failed. He sank to the floor, his strength spent, his hope extinguished. The veiled ones were still with him, their presence lingering, their whispers filling the silence, reminding him of his failure, of his fate. He had tried to sever the bond, but the shadows had taken root too deeply, entwined themselves with his very soul. "You are ours, Alex," they whispered, their voices filled with dark satisfaction. "You belong to us, forever." 8. Acceptance of the shadows. In the days that followed, Alex found himself drifting, his mind numb, his heart empty. He no longer fought the shadows, no longer resisted their pull. The mark had become a part of him, a dark reminder of the connection he could never escape. The veiled ones no longer hid in the corners of his vision. They walked beside him, silent and watchful, their hollow eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond words. He had become one of them, a creature of darkness, bound to the shadows, his life a mere echo of what it had once been. This expanded chapter follows Alex's attempt at the ritual of binding in full, incorporating his visions, his ultimate failure, and the hollow acceptance of his fate. Let me know if you'd like additional development on any particular scenes or further elaboration on his psychological struggle. Chapter 8. The Depths of the Shadow Realm. 1. The descent into the heart of darkness. Alex could no longer remember how long he had been in the Shadow Realm. Time, as he had once understood it, had dissolved into a vast, endless night. Days and hours held no meaning here. There was only the darkness, an eternal void that stretched beyond comprehension. He drifted, a silent spectre, moving through a world that felt both familiar and foreign. The surroundings became darker, deeper, as he ventured further into the heart of the Shadow Realm. Shapes blurred and twisted, fading into shadow, and everything, every structure, every ghostly figure he encountered, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air was thick and cold, laden with the scent of decay and something sharper, metallic, that made his skin prickle. He felt as though he were being pulled, drawn by an unseen force, deeper and deeper into the very soul of this place. It was an ancient pull, magnetic and overwhelming, and he was helpless to resist it. Each step carried him further from the remnants of his humanity, binding him more tightly to the world of shadows. 2. Visions of the living world. As he drifted, hollow and empty, fragments of the world he had left behind began to appear around him. Twisted visions that flickered in and out of focus, like memories viewed through a fogged mirror. He saw his apartment, his childhood home, the faces of friends and family, but each image was distorted, warped by the darkness that had claimed him. In one vision, he saw his mother, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with sorrow as she stared at a photograph of him. She looked older, as though the weight of his disappearance had aged her. Alex reached out, desperate to touch her, to feel some connection to the life he had lost. But his hand passed through her image, meeting nothing but cold, empty air. The vision faded, replaced by another, a scene from his childhood, a memory of him playing in the yard with his sister. But even this memory was tainted by the darkness. His sister's face was obscured, her laughter twisted into a haunting, echoing cry that filled him with an inexplicable dread. One by one, the visions appeared and vanished, each one a reminder of the life he had left behind, a life that felt like a distant, fading dream. The images haunted him, filling him with a sorrow that cut deeper than any fear. He was a shadow now, a mere echo of the person he had once been, forever separated from the world he had known. 3. Encounter with the Veiled Elder. As he wandered further, he became aware of a new presence, something far older and more powerful than the veiled ones he had encountered before. It was a figure shrouded in layers of shadow, its form immense and towering, its hollow eyes glowing with a deep, ancient intelligence that sent a shiver through his soul. This was no ordinary veiled one. It was an elder, a being that had existed in the shadow realm since time immemorial, a creature that had watched countless souls succumb to the darkness. The veiled elder regarded him with a cold, unblinking gaze, as though it were examining his very essence, searching for the last fragments of humanity that clung to him. "You have come far, Alex," it said, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the shadow realm. Few have ventured this deep. Few have given themselves so completely to the darkness. Alex felt a chill wash over him, a cold that seemed to penetrate his very bones. The elder's gaze was like a weight pressing down on him, filling him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. "You are no longer of the living," the elder continued, its voice a hollow whisper. "The shadows have claimed you, bound you to their will. But there is one final step, one last transformation that awaits you, if you choose to embrace it." 4. The choice. The elder's words filled him with a mixture of horror and fascination. He had come this far, given so much of himself to the darkness, and yet he felt a spark of resistance, a faint, fragile thread of his old self that clung to life, to the memories of the world he had left behind. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, his voice trembling, barely audible. The elder's eyes narrowed, its expression unreadable. "You will remain in limbo, a shadow lost between worlds, forever haunted by the life you abandoned. You will wander these depths, a hollow echo, a creature of neither life nor death." Alex's heart ached with the weight of his decision. To remain as he was would mean an eternity of isolation, of endless torment. But to surrender completely, to embrace the shadows, would mean losing the last remnants of his humanity, becoming a part of the darkness that had claimed him. The elder watched him in silence, waiting, its gaze filled with an ancient patience. It offered no guidance, no hint of what lay beyond this final step. The choice was his alone. 5. Embracing the darkness. With a deep, shuddering breath, Alex closed his eyes, feeling the darkness coil around him, cold and comforting, a heavy weight that promised release from all pain, all sorrow. He let himself sink into it, surrendering to the shadows, letting them wrap around his mind, his soul, consuming every thought, every memory, until there was nothing left but darkness. As he opened his eyes, he felt a profound transformation take place. His body was no longer solid, no longer bound by the constraints of flesh and bone. He was a creature of shadows now, a being of pure darkness, his form shifting and twisting, blending with the shadows that surrounded him. He looked down at his hands, or what had once been his hands, and saw that they were mere outlines, dark wisps of smoke that curled and flickered in the dim light. His eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, hollow, reflecting the darkness that had claimed him. The elder nodded, a faint approving gesture. "Welcome to the eternal night, Alex. You are one of us now, a keeper of the shadows, a guardian of the forgotten." 6. A new purpose. As he took his place among the veiled ones, Alex felt a strange peace settle over him. The fears, the doubts, the memories of his old life. All of it faded, dissolving into the darkness. He was no longer bound by the constraints of human thought or emotion. He was a creature of pure instinct, driven by the will of the shadows, a guardian of the realm that lay beyond the reach of light. The veiled ones moved around him, their forms blending with his own, their presence a comforting weight that filled him with a sense of purpose, of belonging. He was no longer alone, no longer haunted by the life he had left behind. He was a part of something vast and eternal, a being of darkness, bound to the shadow realm. He drifted through the depths, his mind quiet, his thoughts empty, content to exist as a shadow, a hollow echo of the person he had once been. He was a guardian now, a watcher in the dark, a keeper of secrets that would never see the light of day. 7. Visions of the forgotten. As a new entity within the shadow realm, Alex began to see things he hadn't before. Lost memories, forgotten moments, lives that had faded into obscurity. He was now privy to all of them. Souls drifted through his awareness, flashes of lives long past, faces twisted in anguish, in joy, in despair. He could feel their emotions, fragments of their memories, each one a piece of the darkness he now called home. He saw flashes of ancient battles, whispered secrets, forbidden knowledge that had been buried in the depths of the shadows. Each memory was a thread in the vast tapestry of the shadow realm, a piece of the darkness that had woven itself into the fabric of existence. And in each vision, he saw himself reflected, a dark figure watching from the shadows, a silent witness to the lives that had passed into obscurity. He was a part of them now, a keeper of the forgotten, a guardian of memories that would never be remembered. 8. A final goodbye. In his final moments of awareness, Alex felt a faint echo of his old life, a fleeting memory of the person he had once been. He saw his family, his friends, the places he had known, each one a ghostly image that flickered in the darkness, fading into the shadows that surrounded him. He felt a pang of sorrow, a brief, fleeting regret for the life he had lost, the person he had once been. But as the shadows closed in, the regret faded, replaced by a cold, empty peace. He was a shadow now, a creature of darkness, bound to the shadow realm for all eternity. As he drifted deeper into the darkness, he felt the last remnants of his humanity slip away, dissolving into the void. He was no longer Alex, no longer a person, but a being of pure darkness, a part of the eternal night, a keeper of secrets, a guardian of the forgotten. And in that final moment, as the darkness consumed him, he understood the true nature of the shadow realm, the beauty and the horror of an existence beyond light, beyond life, beyond memory. He was lost, and he was content. This expanded chapter delves into Alex's transformation, his acceptance of his fate, and the haunting beauty of his new existence. Each section is designed to heighten the sense of loss, isolation, and the surreal horror of his final moments as he becomes a creature of the shadows. Let me know if you need additional expansions on any specific part or more details on his thoughts and emotions as he fully transforms. Chapter 9. Whispers of the Forgotten. 1. The Dawnless World. In the shadow realm, there was no dawn, no dusk, only a constant, unchanging twilight that bathed everything in hues of grey and black. Time had no meaning here, each moment blending into the next, in an endless continuum. Alex, or what remained of him, drifted through this eternal night, his thoughts vague and fragmented, remnants of a mind that had once been human. His form was less substantial now, a dark silhouette that merged with the shadows around him, shifting and blurring, a part of the darkness itself. He was aware of himself in an abstract way, a silent witness to the strange and twisted landscape that had become his home. The veiled ones moved around him, their presence a constant weighty pressure that reminded him of his purpose in this forsaken place. Alex was no longer himself. He was a guardian of the forgotten, a watcher in the dark, bound to this world for eternity. Yet, despite the peace he had felt upon his transformation, a faint, persistent ache stirred within him. A whisper of something lost, a fragment of a memory he could not fully recall. Disti, too, the gathering of lost souls. The Shadow Realm was populated by others like him, souls who had surrendered to the darkness, remnants of people who had been forgotten by the world. They drifted aimlessly, their forms indistinct, merging with the shadows, silent echoes of the lives they had once led. Each one was a story untold, a memory erased, lost to the passage of time. Occasionally, Alex would sense a presence nearby, a fellow shadow, its outline flickering like a fading candle. They moved without purpose, each bound to their own corner of the Shadow Realm, a silent testament to lives that had been claimed by the darkness. He encountered one such figure, a woman with an aura of sorrow so deep it seemed to chill the very air around her. She looked at him, her hollow eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, he felt a surge of recognition, as though he had known her in a life long past. Her face was blurred, indistinct, but he could feel the weight of her memories, fragments of a life that had been consumed by darkness. Without words, she reached out, her hand passing through him, a faint gesture of longing, of despair. She faded into the shadows once more, leaving him alone with a feeling of profound emptiness, a reminder of the fate that awaited every soul that ventured too close to the veil. 3. The voices in the void. In the depths of the Shadow Realm, whispers filled the air, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. They were faint at first, like a distant murmur, but as Alex wandered deeper, the voices grew louder, distinct, each one telling a story, a memory that had been lost to the world. These whispers were fragments of lives, memories that had drifted into the Shadow Realm, preserved in the darkness, bound to the place where forgotten things came to rest. He heard the laughter of children, the cries of the heartbroken, the screams of the betrayed. Each voice was a thread in a tapestry woven from sorrow, a dark melody that resonated through the Shadow Realm. Drawn to these voices, Alex followed the sound, his form drifting through the shadows, each whisper tugging at him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the darkness. The memories he encountered were vivid, each one a glimpse into a life that had ended in despair. 4. Visions of the Ancient Ones. As he journeyed further, Alex began to sense a presence beyond even the Veiled Ones, a deeper, more ancient force that governed the Shadow Realm, a being that existed beyond comprehension, woven into the very fabric of the darkness. It was not a creature, but a consciousness, a will that permeated every shadow, every whisper, a presence that observed all who entered its domain. One night, as he drifted through a twisted landscape of darkened ruins, he felt the presence reach out to him, enveloping him in a cold, oppressive energy. His vision blurred, and he found himself standing before a vast, featureless expanse, an endless void that seemed to pulse with life. The darkness moved, shifting like liquid, forming shapes that twisted and melted, each one more terrible than the last. The Ancient Ones, he realized, were not bound by form or shape. They were the essence of the Shadow Realm itself, the keepers of forbidden knowledge, beings older than time, woven from the very substance of darkness. They regarded him with a silent intensity, their gaze filling his mind with visions of forgotten worlds, ancient civilizations lost to time, secrets that had been buried in the depths of the shadows. In their presence he felt small, insignificant, a mere shadow among shadows, bound to a purpose he could barely comprehend. They did not speak, but he felt their knowledge, their understanding, seep into him, a silent exchange that filled him with a sense of awe and dread. 5. The burden of memory. In the presence of the Ancient Ones, Alex was given a new understanding of his purpose. He was not merely a guardian of the Shadow Realm. He was a keeper of memories, a vessel for the forgotten. Every soul that entered the Shadow Realm, every life that faded into obscurity, would become a part of him, their memories woven into the fabric of his being, preserved in the darkness. He felt the weight of these memories settle upon him, a heavy, suffocating burden that pressed down on his soul. Each memory was a fragment of a life, a glimpse into a story that had been lost to time. He saw glimpses of wars fought and lost, loves unrequited, dreams that had crumbled into dust. Each memory was a thread in a vast, intricate tapestry, a story that would never be told. As he absorbed these memories, he felt himself becoming something more, something ancient and eternal, a being bound not by flesh but by the weight of forgotten lives. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of memories that had been erased from the world, a silent witness to the tragedies of the past. 6. The temptation of power. The longer he remained in the Shadow Realm, the more he understood the power that lay within the darkness. The memories he absorbed, the knowledge he gained, they were a source of strength, a wellspring of energy that filled him with a sense of purpose. He could feel the darkness feeding him, nurturing him, transforming him into something more than he had ever been. But with this power came a temptation, a pull that tugged at the remnants of his humanity, urging him to embrace the darkness fully, to surrender his last shreds of individuality and become one with the shadows. The Ancient Ones offered him visions of immortality, a life unbound by the constraints of the physical world, a place among the most powerful entities in the Shadow Realm. It would be so easy to give in, to let go of the memories that weighed him down, to merge with the darkness, to become a part of the eternal night that stretched before him. But a faint whisper in his mind held him back, a fragment of his old self, a voice that reminded him of the life he had once known, a life that he was not yet ready to abandon. Wandafimi 7. An encounter with a soul, unwilling to surrender. One night, as he wandered through the ruins of the Shadow Realm, Alex encountered a figure that stood apart from the others. It was a man, his form clearer, more defined, his expression fierce, determined. Unlike the other souls he had encountered, this one had not surrendered to the shadows. He was fighting, resisting, clinging to the memories of his past life with a tenacity that was both inspiring and tragic. The man looked at Alex, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "There must be a way out," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. A way to escape, to return to the world of the living. Alex felt a pang of sorrow, a faint echo of the emotions he had once known. He wanted to tell the man that escape was impossible, that the darkness held them all, binding them to an eternity of shadows. But he could not bring himself to speak, could not bear to extinguish the last spark of hope that lingered in the man's eyes. Without a word, the man turned and walked away, his form fading into the shadows, leaving Alex alone with the weight of his silence. Tit Asata 8. Acceptance of eternity. As the memories continued to accumulate within him, Alex felt himself slipping further into the darkness, his mind merging with the shadows, becoming one with the memories he was destined to preserve. He was no longer a single soul, but a vessel, a collector of forgotten lives, a keeper of the past. The Ancient Ones watched him, their presence a constant reminder of his purpose, a silent assurance that he was now a part of something greater, something eternal. He was a guardian of the Shadow Realm, a creature of darkness bound to an eternity of silence and solitude. He felt no sorrow, no regret. The emotions he had once known, the memories of the life he had left behind, were fading, dissolving into the shadows that surrounded him. He was a part of the darkness now, a being of pure instinct, a keeper of secrets that would never see the light of day. And in that final moment, as he drifted deeper into the heart of the Shadow Realm, he understood the true nature of his existence. He was a shadow among shadows, a silent witness to the forgotten, a guardian of memories that would never be remembered. He was lost, and he was content. This expanded chapter emphasizes Alex's transformation into a keeper of the forgotten, his encounters with lost souls, and his acceptance of an eternity in the shadow realm. It delves into his growing power, the temptation of surrender, and the haunting beauty of his purpose, capturing the surreal horror of becoming a creature bound to memory and shadow. Let me know if you need additional elaboration on specific sections, or more interactions with other souls and entities in the shadow realm. Chapter 10. The Final Eclipse. 1. The end of all recognition. Alex could no longer remember how he had arrived at this point, nor could he recall the face he once wore, the hands he once used, or the sounds he once heard. His being was a blur, a shape that floated without substance or solidity. Only fragments of memory remained, scattered thoughts of warmth and light. But they were distant, faint echoes that dissolved as soon as he tried to grasp them. He was aware only of darkness, an unending, formless void that pulsed with a rhythm too slow to be human, a sound too deep to be heard. Here, at the heart of the shadow realm, all things had lost their boundaries. His form, his identity, everything that had once made him human was fading, dissolving into the shadows that embraced him. Yet, within this dissolution, he sensed something vast, an intelligence that was beyond comprehension. It was the shadow realm itself, a presence that watched, waiting for the final fragments of his consciousness to fade. 2. An ocean of forgotten faces. As he drifted deeper into the shadows, faces began to appear around him. Countless faces, each one a memory, a life that had been claimed by the darkness. They moved through him, around him, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in silent sorrow. Each face was a fragment of a soul, a piece of a life that had been lost to the shadow realm, a whisper of something forgotten. Alex could feel their emotions, an overwhelming tide of sorrow, regret, longing, all of it merging with his own consciousness, filling him with a despair that went beyond anything he had ever known. He was not alone, yet he was isolated, surrounded by the echoes of lives that had been erased, each one a story that would never be told. The faces drifted closer, merging with him, their memories seeping into his mind, their stories becoming a part of him. He was a vessel now, a keeper of forgotten lives, bound to the darkness for eternity. And as he absorbed each memory, he felt his own identity fading, slipping away into the sea of shadows. 3. The Whispering Void. The voices filled his mind, a chorus of whispers that overlapped and echoed, each one a fragment of a memory, a piece of a life that had been left behind. They spoke of love and loss, joy and despair, each whisper a reminder of the humanity he had once known. But as he listened, he felt a strange peace settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the void that had claimed him. He was no longer bound by the fears, the desires, the attachments that had once defined him. Here, in the shadow realm, he was free, unburdened by the weight of his past, a silent observer of the endless night. The whispers grew louder, filling the void with a haunting melody that resonated through his being. Each voice was a thread in a vast tapestry, a part of the darkness that had woven itself into his soul. He was no longer a single consciousness, but a multitude, a chorus of voices bound together in the silence of the shadows. 4. A glimpse of eternity. In this state of dissolution, Alex began to see visions, glimpses of the eternity that stretched before him, an endless expanse of darkness that reached beyond time, beyond existence. He saw worlds that had been consumed by the shadows, civilizations that had faded into oblivion, each one a part of the tapestry of the shadow realm. He saw himself, a being of pure shadow, drifting through the ruins of existence, surrounded by echoes of lives that had been lost. He was a part of the darkness, a silent witness to the end of all things, a keeper of secrets that would never be revealed. The vision filled him with a sorrow that went beyond words, a grief that resonated with the souls of the forgotten. He was a part of their sorrow, their regret, an embodiment of the despair that had been cast into the shadows, a being bound to the eternal night. 5. The presence of the Ancient Ones. As he drifted through the void, he sensed a presence, the Ancient Ones, beings that had existed since the beginning of time, woven into the very fabric of the shadow realm. They were not creatures of flesh or spirit, but entities of pure darkness, the essence of the shadows given form. They appeared around him, their forms shifting and blurring, their hollow eyes gleaming with a dark, ancient intelligence. They regarded him with a silent intensity, their gaze penetrating his consciousness, peeling back the layers of his mind, examining every thought, every memory he had ever known. "You are one of us now," they whispered, their voices a low, resonant echo that filled his mind. "You are a part of the eternal night, a keeper of the forgotten, bound to the darkness for all eternity." Their words resonated within him, filling him with a sense of purpose, a knowledge that went beyond understanding. He was no longer an individual, no longer a single consciousness, but a fragment of something vast, a part of the darkness that stretched across all of existence. 6. The final surrender. The Ancient Ones extended their hands, their fingers cold and shadowed, and Alex knew what was expected of him. This was the final step, the last surrender, a complete dissolution of self, a merging with the darkness that would erase his memories, his identity, leaving only a hollow vessel, a being of pure shadow. He hesitated, feeling the faint echoes of his old life, the memories of warmth, of light. But the shadows called to him, their whispers filling his mind, urging him to let go, to embrace the eternal night that awaited him. With a deep, shuddering breath, he took the hands of the Ancient Ones, feeling the darkness seep into him, filling every corner of his consciousness, dissolving the last remnants of his humanity. His thoughts faded, his memories slipping away, replaced by the silence of the shadows, a cold, empty peace that filled him with a strange sense of completion. In that final moment, he understood his purpose, his place within the shadow realm. He was a guardian, a keeper of the forgotten, a being bound to the darkness for all eternity. 7. The echo of life. As he drifted into the darkness, he felt himself dissolve, his form merging with the shadows, becoming one with the realm that had claimed him. He was no longer a separate entity, but a part of the fabric of the shadow realm, a silent presence woven into the endless night. He could feel the lives he had absorbed, the memories of the souls that had passed through the shadows, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of the darkness. He was a part of them, and they were a part of him, bound together in an eternal cycle of life and death, memory and forgetting. In this state, he was neither alive nor dead, neither human nor spirit, but something beyond, a being of pure shadow, a keeper of the past, a guardian of the forgotten. He was content, at peace, a part of the endless night that stretched before him, an eternity of silence and solitude. 8. A last flicker of consciousness. In his final moments of awareness, Alex saw a faint glimmer of light, a memory of his old life, a fragment of the person he had once been. It was a fleeting image, a vision of warmth, of laughter, of a life filled with color and light. But as he reached out, the light faded, swallowed by the darkness, leaving him alone in the shadows. The memory was gone, a distant echo that would never return, a reminder of the life he had left behind. He felt a brief pang of sorrow, a faint whisper of regret, but it faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold, comforting embrace of the darkness. 9. The silent vigil. As the darkness closed in, Alex found himself in a state of quiet vigilance, a silent guardian of the shadow realm. He was a part of the night now, a fragment of the eternal darkness, a being without form or memory, a silent keeper of the forgotten. He drifted through the shadows, a watcher in the dark, a presence that moved through the void without purpose, without thought. He was a part of the darkness, and the darkness was a part of him, bound together in an eternal dance that would never end. In that final silence, he was content. He was the final eclipse, a silent witness to the end of all things, a guardian of the forgotten, a keeper of secrets that would never be told. And in that final silence, he was at peace. This expanded chapter brings Alex's journey to a close with a haunting blend of horror and peace, exploring his final moments of consciousness, his merging with the darkness, and his acceptance of his role in the shadow realm. Each part builds on the surreal atmosphere and profound sense of loss, offering a fitting conclusion to his transformation. Let me know if you'd like additional expansions or specific focus on any elements within this final chapter. Epilogue. Shadows in Silence. The Shadow Realm held no concept of endings. Its endless night stretched beyond the bounds of time, a timeless expanse where memories drifted like echoes, each whisper an echo of a life once lived. Within its depths, the souls of the forgotten lingered, bound together in an eternal vigil, each one a keeper of memories that the world above had long since abandoned. Alex had become one of them, a guardian of the dark, a silent observer, his humanity dissolved, replaced by the quiet consuming presence of the shadows. He was not alone. He was surrounded by the souls of countless others, each one a fragment of the whole, woven into the fabric of the shadow realm. Together, they formed a chorus of silence, a collective consciousness bound to an eternity of watching, of waiting. Above, in the world of the living, the memory of Alex began to fade. His name was spoken less often, his face slowly forgotten, until he too became part of the stories that lingered only in faint, fading recollections. And in time, those who had known him moved on, their lives carrying them forward into their own futures, while he remained, a shadow among shadows, a figure lost in the endless twilight. But for Alex, there was a strange peace in this existence. He was part of something larger, something eternal, a presence that would endure as long as the shadows themselves. No longer haunted by fear or sorrow, he had found his place, a role in the mysterious vastness of the shadow realm, a quiet sentinel, a keeper of lives forgotten, a vessel of memories that would never see the light. And so, the shadow realm carried on, as it always had, a dark tapestry woven with the stories of those who had been lost to its depths, their whispers filling the silence, their lives preserved in shadow. In the end, all that remained was the darkness, endless, eternal, and quietly watching, as it had done since the beginning of time.